The final discussion for our course involves poetry from the time of the U.S. Civil War. Now, the title is a little misleading because we've actually looked at poetry other places in our course that was written during the war itself. I'm thinking notably here about a lot of the poems from Emily Dickinson are written between 1861 and 1865, and would just as well fit into a discussion here about the poems in the Civil War. But when I'm talking about the poetry of the Civil War, I'm talking instead very specifically about a certain genre of poem that is released during the war, which is a sense in which the writers at the time of the war, as the war is ongoing, are struggling to make sense of it all. And I think probably the best place for us to start with this question is Walt Whitman. So Whitman's Leaves of Grass, as I mentioned in our initial discussion on Whitman, is revised and expanded at multiple points throughout his life after the 1855 publication of Leaves of Grass with 12 poems in it. One of the revisions and expansions that Whitman does is following the U.S. Civil War. Whitman worked as a nurse during the Civil War, tending to men who had gotten injured on the battlefield, or writing letters and helping them communicate to those, their loved ones back home. And you can really get a sense of the optimism and excitement that accompanies the idea that we're off to war in Whitman's poem, Beat, Beat, Drums. This is on page 1232 of the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Volume B, 10th edition. So the drum taps poems, as they're called, these are the poems that Whitman composes during or right after the Civil War. The Leaves of Grass then is expanded to include this. This is not the first expansion that Whitman does, but it's a notable expansion. And Beat, Beat, Drums had a kind of interesting history. It is originally published, and it almost has this kind of recruitment idea to it, right? There is a sense that by the time the Civil War is breaking out, both sides have this sense of a duty to go to war and participate in the war. And that the things that they're fighting for in the war are not just a sense of fighting because they're told that they had to, but there's a real sense that they have a close connection to their home, close connection to the values that their community espoused. The idea of fighting to preserve the Constitution and preserve the Union was very prevalent among soldiers from the North. The idea of fighting to protect a way of life or to protect the rights of individuals or of those within states to make choices was very prominent within those from the South. Not a lot of American soldiers at first have this idea that they're fighting to end slavery, though some do, and more do as the war goes on. And not everyone who fought on the side of the South had an idea that they were fighting to preserve the institution of slavery, though many did, and that continued on through the war. But get a sense here in Whitman's poem, Beat, Beat, Drums, of the sort of nationalistic, rah-rah, we're gonna win this thing, we're gonna run off and fight the war, that you see on display in this poem. Beat, beat, drums, blow, bugles, blow. Through the windows, through doors, burst like a ruthless force. Into the solemn church and scatter the congregation. Into the school where the scholar is studying. Leave not the bridegroom quiet. No happiness must he have now with his bride. Nor the peaceful farmer any peace, plowing his field or gathering his grain. So fierce you whir and pound your drums, so shrill your bugles blow. Beat, Beat drums, blow bugles, blow. Over the traffic of cities, over the rumble of wheels in the street, are beds prepared for sleepers at night in the houses. No sleepers must sleep in those beds. No bargainers bargained by day, no brokers or speculators. Would they continue? Would the talkers be talking? Would the singer attempt to sing? Would the lawyer rise in the court to state his case before the judge, then rattle quicker, heavier drums? You bugles, wilder blow. Beat drums. Blow, bugles, blow. Make no parley. Stop for no expostulation. Mind not the timid. Mind not the weeper or prayer. Mind not the old man beseeching the young man. Let not the child's voice be heard, nor the mother's entreaties. Make even the trestles that shake the dead where they lie, awaiting the hearses. So strong you thump, oh terrible drums, so loud you bugles blow. There's a literal call to arms in this poem. An idea that nobody shall rest easy. Everybody plays a role in fighting this. Right? No bridegroom, time with his bride, or farmer with his plow. The time for that is past. We have a larger calling to attend to. There's a sense as well in one of the poems that I ask you to read. It's the Battle Hymn of the Republic by Julia Ward Howe, that reflect a divine purpose to the war. And I won't read the whole poem, but these are famous lines that you would no doubt recognize from hymns or patriotic songs that people sing. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. I have read a fiery gospel writ in burnished rows of steel. As ye deal with my contemners, so with you my grace shall deal. Let the hero born of woman crush the serpent with his heel, since God is marching on. There's a sense of divine purpose in these lines. There's a sense of welcomed violence, of the fury of the Lord, unleashed on those who oppose him. A righteous fury. The song, as the Norton headnote explains here, the song became popular in regions of the country because it has an ardent religious nationalism. Right? With God on our side, kind of ethos. Captured into the spirit of the North, off to fight. And that when it began to be sung by the Union Army, which it was, it's written to the tune of a folk song about John Brown, the ardent abolitionist who fought to overthrow the government of Virginia and wanted an armed rebellion, armed insurrection of enslaved people to overthrow the government of Virginia, right? If you're familiar with the song of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, it fuses in the chorus from John Brown's body, or John Brown, right? Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. The melody is the same, and the poems then are able to fuse together, and that's what gives Julia Ward Howe's poem such life as it gets transformed and turned into a war song sung by soldiers on the march. Not all of the poems, though, that are produced during the war, and in fact, I'm probably going to put too much of an emphasis maybe on the poems that I think call some of these values into question and ask us to slow down and reconsider some of what we're talking about and analyzing, have that kind of like fervent nationalist zeal to it. I'm thinking of the poem included here by John Greenleaf Whittier, the Quaker and abolitionist poet John Greenleaf Whittier. In Whittier's career, he became very fascinated with poems discussing the meaning of nature or the role of nature. And in that case, nature can have sort of a stand-in for God, or perhaps can be independent from the idea of God. And as you look at Battle Autumn of 1862, I think you can feel part of what Whittier is dealing with, and think too about the way that the poems become more and more complicated as the war itself starts to drag on and on. It's one thing for Whitman to write in 1861, beat, beat, drums beat. Let's go, rah, rah, rah. But as the war continues to drag on, it gets harder and harder to maintain that kind of boundless, infinite positivity and excitement. Whittier writes, "The flags of war like storm birds fly, the charging trumpets blow, yet rolls no thunder in the sky, no earthquake strives below. And calm and patient nature keeps her ancient promise well, though o'er her bloom and greenness sweeps the battle's breath of hell. And still she walks in golden hours through harvest-happy farms, and still she wears her fruits and flowers like jewels upon her arm." And look at the stanza at the bottom of page 1617. "Ah, eyes may be well full of tears, and hearts with hate are hot, but even paced come round the years, and nature changes not. She meets with smiles our bitter grief, with songs our groans of pain. She mocks with tint of flower and leaf, the war field's crimson stain. Still in the cannon's pause we hear her sweet thanksgiving psalm. Too near to God for doubt or fear, she shares the eternal calm. She sees with clearer eye than ours the good of suffering born, and hearts that blossom like her flowers and ripen like her corn." Toward the end of the poem here, Whittier moves into a reflection that nature has a broader perspective on these issues than humans do. And the tragedies, the bloodshed, the violence, the fears, none of that stops the flow and movement of nature, right? The image, she mocks with tint and a flower and leaf, the war field's crimson stain. Right? Flowers keep blooming. No matter, it seems, if the world's falling apart, the world just keeps bringing forth the day. The sun keeps rising. The beautiful world continues. The sense in which the world is indifferent, maybe, but also maybe the world is not indifferent, but the world can see the larger picture. "Oh, give to us her finer ear. Above the stormy din, we too would hear the bells of cheer ring peace and freedom in." Right? So it's a sense of the war is getting complicated, it's getting tough, it's getting violent, but step back and try to see the bigger picture of the war, of the world that we're fighting to protect and the world that we're trying to defend. There's a little bit of that in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Now, Gettysburg Address is not a poem, right? That's important for me to say. Neither is Lincoln's second inaugural. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to talk about the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural as if they are poems, because I think they are highly poetic in what they're trying to do. They have almost the shape of a prose poem to them. Right? I mean, the story of the Gettysburg Address, famous and well known, that when Lincoln finished giving it, nobody clapped because they didn't know that he was done talking. Because the guy who went before Lincoln in the program talked for 2 hours uninterrupted. And Lincoln was done in 2 minutes. And the audience didn't know what to think. But in time, of course, the language of the Gettysburg Address has become some of the most famous rhetoric of American history. Buoyed, I think, by Lincoln's commitment to poetic rhetoric. It's one of the many texts of our course that consciously echo the Declaration of Independence, right? 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Just look in this first sentence, the imagery that has to do with being born, right? They brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty. Right? The rhetoric here, the terms are all metaphoric for the idea of procreation, of bringing something into the world. But now Lincoln says we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. He says the founders created a nation that all men are created equal. And we're engaged in a war that's testing that proposition. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. Tension between death and life and rebirth. Very biblical ideas that Lincoln is weaving into the Gettysburg Address. Remember the context here if you're not familiar with it, right? After the Battle of Gettysburg of July of 1863, so many people lay dead that the dead were simply buried in the battlefield. Bodies weren't sent home at this time. There was an effort to convert some of these large battlefields into national cemeteries. And the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery by Lincoln is a dedication of a cemetery that holds both the Union and the Confederate dead. He says they've been called to dedicate a portion of the battlefield as a final resting place. And now things move a little bit, right? Because in a larger sense, he says, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. So it's not about what's happening now, but it's about what has already happened for Lincoln. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. Notice he's turned the meaning of the word dedicate. right? He's called to give dedication remarks for the Gettysburg National Cemetery. That's the official way that it was presented in the agenda of the ceremony, right? The program of the ceremony. Dedication remarks by the President of the United States. And traditionally, a dedication of a cemetery is more like, saying some words to kind of recognize it and say that this is now a thing that we're doing, right? Like a dedication ceremony where you cut a ribbon. But Lincoln turns that meaning of the word dedication into, now we must have the dedication, ourselves, the living, to go forward. Right? It is for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, for which they gave their lives. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And so now here in the last sentence, Lincoln's bringing all of his themes together in just like the 200 and some words that constitute this address. It's functioning very much like a poem. He's got two themes that he's weaving, and then he weaves them together at the end. He brings them together. We're going to dedicate ourselves to the work that the men who died on the battlefield did. That's the only way their death has meaning, is if we pick up what they died for and we continue fighting for it. Otherwise, he says that they'll have died in vain. And if we do that, Lincoln says, the nation can have a new birth of freedom. The nation originally had a birth of freedom, right? Dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. But now we can give that a rebirth. And we can really mean it this time. We can really make that true this time. We can really make people equal. So that we don't have a land of enslaved people and people who are doing the enslaving, or people who are free and outside the slavery process. But we can have a new birth of freedom. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. What a very memorable line. But that losing the war would mean that we lose that principle, that we lose the opportunity for a new birth of freedom. That sense of trying to make sense of what it all means, we can see that on display as well in some of Whitman's other war poems. Look, if you will, at page 1233, Vigil Strange I Kept on the Field One Night. Vigil strange I kept on the field one night, when you, my son, and my comrade dropped at my side that day. One look I but gave, which your dear eyes returned with a look I shall never forget. One touch of your hand to mine, O boy, reached up as you lay on the ground. Then onward I sped in the battle, the even contested battle, till late in the night relieved to the place at last again I made my way. Found you in death, so cold, dear comrade. Found your body, son, of responding kisses, never again on earth responding. Bared your face in the starlight, curious the scene, cool blew the moderate night wind. Long there and then in vigil I stood, dimly around me the battlefield spreading. Vigil wondrous and vigil sweet, there in the fragrant, silent night. But not a tear fell, not even a long-drawn sigh. Long, long I gazed. Then on the earth, partially reclining, sat by your side, leaning my chin against your hands. Passing sweet hours, immortal and mystic hours, with you, dearest comrade, not a tear, not a word. Vigil of silence, love, and death. Vigil for you, my son and my soldier. And onward silently stars aloft, eastward as new ones upward stole. Vigil final for you, brave boy. I could not save you, swift was your death. I faithfully loved you and cared for you living. I think we shall surely meet again. Till at latest lingering of the night, indeed, just as the dawn appeared, my comrade I wrapped in his blanket, enveloped well his form, folded the blanket well, tucking it carefully overhead and carefully under feet, and there and then, and bathed by the rising sun, my son in his grave, in his rude dug grave, I deposited, ending my vigil strange with that, vigil of night, battlefield dim, vigil for boy of responding kisses, never again on earth responding. Vigil for comrades swiftly slain, vigil I never forget, how as day brightened I rose from the chill ground and folded my soldier well in his blanket and buried him where he fell. This poem has long puzzled people over the speaker of the poem. It's certainly not Whitman, since he didn't fight on battlefields. But is it a father and a son? Does that explain the repeated imagery of my son? Is this a kind of brotherly love between two soldiers as children of a nation, that they have this kind of affectionate relationship between them? Is it perhaps more erotic than that? Whitman's poetry certainly has an infused kind of love, erotic love. Is this a romantic love? Is this a familial love? Is this a brotherly kind of love, a platonic love? It's not entirely clear in the poem, but there is a sense here of the pain that comes with death. The sense of the tragedy experienced in the pain. It's a tearless and speechless kind of mourning in this poem. There's a tenderness to the goodbye. There's also a sense of duty, fighting onward, right? The one falls and the other one runs off to battle and continues and then returns in the night, and the other has died during the intervening time. The vigil occurs all night long. There's little sleeping until the sun rises. And then at the dawn of the sun, that's when the fallen soldier is buried by the other soldier in a grave on the battlefield to the best of his making. Does this poem carry with it the same sort of finding meaning in death that Lincoln's Gettysburg Address has? Is it a different level of meaning? Is this a poem of wordless grief? Is this a sense of the sadness that comes with losing someone that you've grown close to? Is this a sense that the soldiers themselves become like family? Is the son relationship here metaphoric? It's not clear. But the emotion and the feeling and the hope that one day they will see each other again is certainly present in the text. Whitman's poem, A Sight in Camp in the Daybreak Gray and Dim, is another example of this kind of poetic experience of trying to make sense of the war. This one's a short poem as well. A sight in camp in the daybreak gray and dim, as from my tent I emerge so early, sleepless. As slow I walk in the cool, fresh air, the path near by the hospital tent. 3 forms I see on stretchers lying, brought out there untended, lying, over each the blanket spread, ample brownish woolen blanket, gray and heavy blanket, folding, covering all. Curious I halt and silent stand, then with light fingers I from the face of the nearest, the first, just lift the blanket. Who are you, elderly man, so gaunt and grim, with well-grayed hair and flesh all sunken about the eyes? Who are you, my dear comrade? Then to the second I step. And who are you, my child and darling? Who are you, sweet boy with cheeks yet blooming? Then to the third, a face nor child nor old, very calm, as of beautiful yellow-white ivory. Young man, I think I know you. I think this face is the face of the Christ himself, dead and divine and brother of all, and here again he lies. The turn at the end of the poem where Whitman sees in the face of the dead soldier a face that reminds him of Jesus Christ is brought, the layers and themes wrap up on themselves at the end of the poem, right? The 3 dead men on the stretchers are evocative of the image from the Gospels of the 3 crucified men, one of whom is Jesus of Nazareth. We have a young man and an old man here that seem to encompass the range of human male death during the war, both young and old. One face, well-grayed with sunkenness around the eyes, another one seemingly so young and healthy that the cheeks still have a rosy hue to them. And the third, a reminiscent, neither young nor old, but a middle-aged individual, or maybe 30s or so individual. He says, I think I know you. This is the face of the Christ himself, dead and divine and brother of all. And here he lies again. What is the message Whitman is trying to convey about the war, about this fallen soldier? Are these soldiers emblematic of the self-sacrifice that Christ is emblematic of? Are these soldiers dying for a greater cause other than themselves? Is there a kind of emotional distancing that comes from that feeling of recognizing that the soldiers have died for a cause greater than themselves? Gray and cool, cold, death are images that pervade the Drum Taps poems. Let's take a look at Lincoln's second inaugural address to close out our discussion of the poetry of the Civil War. Lincoln's second inaugural is delivered on March 4th, 1865. Up until the early 20th century, presidents were inaugurated in March, not January, which is the way that they are inaugurated now. A little more than a month later, Lincoln would be dead, shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. The second inaugural is not the shortest inaugural address in American history. It's actually the third shortest inaugural address in American history. The shortest one is from George Washington. The second shortest is one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's, and then Lincoln's second inaugural address. It's only about 700 words. Or less, I think. Lincoln, in the second inaugural, takes an opportunity to reframe what he thinks the war has been about. And in doing so, I think, kind of reframe the conflict that has consumed America since the beginning. Since the very beginning of the nation. Maybe the conflict that we've seen all throughout the literature of this course. He said, on the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, that is, when he first took the oath of office, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. Lincoln says, 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Each looked for an easier triumph, he says, and a result less fundamental and astounding. But it's an hour of reckoning for Lincoln. It's an hour of reckoning for the nation. He meditates a bit on divine will. Is there a way that we can ever fully understand what happens? Why it happens? For Lincoln and for many in his time and for many in our own time, that is a question of the providence and will of God. The divine will of a supreme deity that oversees all of us. But it doesn't have to be a divine will, right? You can read this very well as God as a stand-in for fate, or God as a stand-in for the universe, or God as a stand-in for simply the passage of time and the events of humans. Why do the things happen that do happen in the text? Or in life? The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully, Lincoln says. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come. But woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came. Shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers of a living God always ascribe to him? Is the war God's punishment for the presence of slavery in America? What do we have to do to get right by that? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, and so it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. If God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, right? If this war has to continue until all the wealth accumulated by those in the South who use slavery is demolished, so must it be said that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous together, with malice toward none, with charity toward all, firmness in the right, so that God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall be born in the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to establish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. A few final words here at the end of our course. We've devoted a substantial amount of time this course to analyzing American literature before the Civil War. It's been my goal throughout this entire course to try to establish a narrative for you, a narrative that understands the United States as caught in a tension between freedom and enslavement, between liberty of the self and the captivity that others have been held in. Every advancement of freedom and liberty and growth for one person frequently comes at the expense of somebody else. America is a battle. The history of American literature and the history of America is a battle through these various intellectual movements. The rise of the Puritans meeting with the rise of the Enlightenment. The rise of the Enlightenment met with the rise of Romanticism. The Civil War tears a lot of that down. It's hard to be a romantic after the Civil War. The grim realities of the world seem far too strong and powerful for many people at that time. It's an ongoing fight. It's a fight that many of us are still consumed with today. But we understand it better when we look at it more closely. We understand it better when we study history and we study the artifacts of the people who lived there and what they made, how they thought about it. And we hope that by gaining access to their privileged thoughts in the form of their literature, we can have a greater understanding of how they thought about their own time and how what their thoughts perhaps can help us think about our own time. There's almost no text that we've read this entire course that can't speak somehow to a conflict that we experience today. The details might change, the context might change, the culture itself is changing, but somewhere under each of our texts is a universal human experience. And I have always thought that the way that we understand how to move forward with the problems of our own time is to think about the way those in the past processed and moved forward, reflected on, commented on the problems of their time. It's been a pleasure teaching you American literature before the Civil War. Thank you for watching these videos and sticking with me throughout the course. As always, there are many other wonderful literature courses offered by our college, and I hope you have an opportunity to take one of them. Every course you take in literature is an opportunity to become more empathetic, to grow, to learn about the forces that operate in the world among us, and to become a person whose critical thinking and problem-solving skills are enhanced by the study of art, culture, history, and human experience. Thank you.